Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. Today's show is a departure from the types of shows we normally do on 30 Minutes here at Radnor Studio 21. Normally, I would have a guest sitting at my left. We've had a variety of guests over the past several years, and we'd be talking about different topics that I hope are of interest and occasionally entertaining. The idea for this show occurred to me the other evening. I was wrapping up a course I teach at Villanova, the title of which is Organizational and Leadership Communication. And I was going over with the class, it was the final night, going over with the class 14 principles or tenets that have developed, or I have had the opportunity to develop working with others, over my 35 years as a consultant and counselor to senior management in organizations around the country and occasionally in other countries. And it occurred to me that the principles are as applicable to our life in our homes, our relationships with other people, as well as to organizations, companies, and so on. They are applicable to any situation where human beings come together in an enterprise ostensibly in a common cause. They have to do with relationships, interrelationships. They have to do with the effectiveness of communication. They have to do with leadership. All of the things that I think have relevance today are critically important today as we watch the headlines and try to figure out what's going on, what motivates the behaviors we see, what influences the outcomes that we see and very often have to put up with, even though we may not agree with them. So what I'd like to do today is to take them one at a time, comment on them, and hope that you will decide for yourselves whether or not they are relevant to your personal situation, whether it's at home, in your relationship with a significant other, your relationship with other family members, or your relationship at work. The first principle goes something like this. All living things are in perpetual motion, therefore change is inexorable. Change is inexorable. What I mean by that is that we are all of us, whether it's an organization or an individual, in a constant state of change. It may be imperceptible. We may not even be aware of it. But if we're not changing, if organizations are not changing or not moving, then they are probably in some stage of decline or extinction, either physically or spiritually. The point is that we must be aware of the fact that we are in a constant state of change, even though it may be subtle nuance. And if we are aware of it, we can prepare for it and develop an attitude of readiness so that we can react. We develop agility, flexibility, so we can modify ourselves, our lifestyles, our relationships to accommodate changes in our environment. So often, particularly these days, bad economy, world on fire in different parts of the globe, we look at the headlines, we read the headlines, we hear the headlines at the end of the day or the first thing in the morning, and we feel overwhelmed by the changes that are occurring because of the rate of change. It's accelerating because of the barrage of information. It's not even information, it's data points that are assaulting us every single day. We try to make sense of it, which brings us to the second of the two principles, that is that people's and organizations' reactions to change progress through 6 stages. I call them Anthony's 6 G's of change. And they are gasping, groaning, griping, groping, grasping, and growing. I love the alliteration. It took me a long time to try to get them right in the correct sequence. Gasping, groaning, and griping. Groping, grasping, and growing. The first 3, gasping, groping, and griping, describe the emotional reaction to change. And we all go through it. Organizations go through it. The first reaction, the gasping, is it will never happen. The second is it could happen. And the third, at griping, is by God, it is going to happen. And coming to grips with the reality that we are truly being confronted with change, sometimes traumatic, life-changing change. Then we go through a transition to what I call the rational or intellectual reactions to change, and that's groping for solutions or options, grasping for the solutions or options that seem to be most viable, seem to be attainable, and finally growing, accepting the fact that change has occurred, we must adapt to it, modify our behavior, learn from the experience, and then the cycle starts all over again, because if you go back to the first principle, we and organizations with which we are associated are in a constant state of change. It's never ending. Again, it may be subtle, imperceptible to us, but it is occurring. And in the absence of it, we begin to die. Organizations begin to die or move towards extinction, either physically or spiritually. So the 6 G's of change are important to management, as well as to parents or other people in authority, leaders, to understand where individuals and organizations are on this continuum of change: gasping, groaning, griping, groping, grasping, and growing. Because the types of communications, the mechanisms and strategies that may be put in place to move people along the continuum will vary, will change, will be dependent upon where individuals and organizations are on the continuum. How much information they need, when they need it, from whom they need it, to move them along. It certainly happens in our relationships with our children, because very often children are gasping, groaning, and griping as they are forced to adapt, to modify their behavior to certain changes occurring in the family situation or in some other aspect of their environment, whether it's school or home or whatever. Which brings us to the third principle or tenet in my 14 tenets to understand the motivation behind behavior. And that is that share of mind is a prerequisite for permanent change. Anything less is malicious or benign obedience. This one has particular application in organizations, companies, large groups of people. I learned this years ago when I was in advertising and public relations and marketing. And I learned from my copy chief that share of mind precedes share of market. What he was saying was that through our advertising or public relations or marketing initiatives, we had to first get to the head and the heart before we could get to the pocketbook. Share of mind precedes share of market. I modified that so that in a consulting context it reads, share of mind is a prerequisite for permanent change. You can impose change, you can require change through threat of punishment, but it will be temporary and only temporary. People revert to the previous state. Share of mind, if you can get the share of mind, first get them to buy in as a prerequisite to permanent changes in attitude, permanent changes in behavior, that is good, healthy change. Anything less is malicious or benign obedience. I've been in so many situations in corporate settings where change or a change in a rule, a policy, a practice was imposed on employees without any reason given, without any accommodation, without any sense of the effect it was having on those people. The result was, yes, compliant behavior, but malicious, sometimes benign behavior on the part of employees. Again, we see that in families as well. So share of mind is a prerequisite to permanent change. The fourth principle is that people and organizations experience periods of integration and disintegration. This is a simple one, but a profound one, because it does help to understand this sense of difference, the sense we have that something isn't right, something is different. I believe that individuals and organizations do go through periods of integration and disintegration. I believe further that we are presently in a period of disintegration, when every institution that we've counted on in the past seems to have been broken. It was summed up years ago in an interview I was conducting with a company that had been at the top of its game and was experiencing some serious trouble. They were having some global competition, they were having labor problems, some of the products that had been theirs, that had the franchise, were all of a sudden being taken over by competitors. They were in a state of trauma. I was conducting a series of interviews with all of the members of the senior management team, and I got to the end of the day with the senior vice president of marketing, and she was slumped in her chair, exhausted, despondent, and she said, everything seems to be broken all at the same time. I'd never heard that before, but it summed up beautifully what was going on in that organization. I think it sums up what's going on in our society today. Everything seems to be broken all at the same time. We will come out of this and we will go into another period of integration, of alignment, of harmony, a sense of unity. But we will invariably, inevitably go through another period of disintegration. It is inevitable. It will happen. Again, the important thing is to understand the process, understand the dynamic, so that we can anticipate it, prepare for it, and not be terribly rattled by it. And know that we will go through another period of integration and invariably another period of disintegration. It's part of the natural law. The fifth principle, or tenet, is that systems evolve iteratively, that's a hard word, iteratively over time, from simple to the complex, from small scale to large scale, and back again. We've seen that again and again in corporate America, where an organization gets to be of such a large size, or the system becomes so complex, or a government bureaucracy becomes so large, so complex, that it falls in on itself. Systems, again, part of the natural law, seem to go from tiny to mid-size to large, and then reach a point, an inflection point, where they revert, where they have to reinvent themselves, and they go back to a simple unit. The genius of GE under Jack Welch years ago was that he and the management team were able to manage that humongous global organization in units, in bits and pieces, broke it down into smaller parts that were manageable, where communication could flow, where people were connected with what they were doing, rather than feeling they were a part of a monolithic organization of gargantuan proportions with which they had no connection and over which they had no control. So the secret, the genius of GE at that time, and of other organizations like GE, large in size, complex in scope, is to break it down into smaller units. We do the same thing, I think, in sports. We do the same thing in a number of other activities where we take something that is large and complex, break it down into units where people understand what's expected of them and are able to deliver on their full capabilities to deliver what's expected of them, to achieve specific objectives and goals. So that's the fifth principle. Systems evolve iteratively over time, from the simple to the complex, from small scale to large scale, and back again. We will see this huge bureaucratic government at the federal level that we have in place now, over time, begin to collapse, to be constrained, and to be shrunken somewhat to something that is more manageable, simpler, and is more productive. It will take time, but it will happen, as it always does. The sixth principle, or tenet, is that in the absence of a contravening force, people and organizations revert to their previous state. We see it, you see it again and again. It happens every year at about New Year's Eve, when we all make New Year's resolutions. And they might be good for a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month. But we inevitably revert to our previous state. We give up. In the absence of a contravening force, some incentive or some negative consequence, we and organizations revert to. Again, important to understand the principle and the application of the principle, to understand that unless there is a contravening force, unless there is some energy that is sustaining change, whether it's change in your individual behavior, change in an organization, change in a work team, that group, individual, organization will revert to the previous state because it's the natural thing to do. It's a comfort zone. We don't like leaving comfort zones, and so there is an inclination for us to revert to the comfort zone. The seventh principle is that, left unfettered, organizations are governed by natural cycles of expansion, that is creative innovation, and contraction, creative destruction. It's somewhat similar to one of the earlier principles about going through periods of integration and disintegration, and another one that we move from the simple to the complex. This one is a bit more specific. This one is suggesting that creative innovation is good, but that creative destruction can be good as well. It helps to purge an organization of the parts, the systems, the toxins within an organization that are destructive, so that the organization comes out stronger and healthier. It goes through another period of creative innovation. Once again, the point of the principle is to understand that there is a natural cycle in organizations, and that there is the need to manage the cycle, but there need not be something in place to try to stop the cycle, better to manage it, let the natural flow go through the organization, than to try to do something that is unusual, that is extraordinary. Change cannot be stopped. It can be managed and directed, but change cannot be stopped. The eighth principle is one of my favorites because it explains the underlying principle behind compensation and reward programs in most organizations. People do what's valued, observed, measured, and rewarded. People do what's valued, that's called culture in corporate speak, observed, it's the management systems that are put in place, measured, that's the performance evaluation systems in most corporations, and rewarded, and that is in most cases cash compensation, but it may be some other form of recognition or reward. As I said, I believe this is the underpinning, or should be the underpinning, of the design of most compensation or reward programs in an organization or in your home or in your dealings with other people. People do what's valued, observed, measured, and rewarded. I've seen so many compensation programs that seem to have ignored this principle, and therefore they don't work. They try to force behaviors, or they put in place rewards that are contrary to the kinds of behaviors that are in fact observed, measured, and rewarded in an organization. One quick example in sales, for example. The culture may be that it rewards superstars, individuals, whereas the reward system is designed to reward groups or team selling. Well, if you have that conflict, if you have that paradox in the system, it simply isn't going to work. People do what is valued, observed, measured, and rewarded. The ninth in the series of 14 is that high intelligence is not an equivalent surrogate for competency and common sense. Again, may seem like a statement of the obvious. Perhaps it's sufficient just to point it out. I have seen, you have seen, in a number of cases, people who have risen to the top based on their IQ. Very bright people, extremely bright people, but are not competent and have no common sense. And it shows in their leadership style. They may have a high IQ, but they have a low emotional intelligence quotient. And that is the ability to relate, to be aware of circumstance, to be empathetic towards other people, to establish relationships. There's a fellow named Ed Wallace who has developed what he calls the relational capital ladder. And there are stages and there's a methodology to move relationships up on the relational capital ladder to get to the point of trust, where people can genuinely be of help to one another because the relationship is authentic. High intelligence is not an equivalent surrogate for competency and common sense. The 10th, there is no infallible correlation between effort and success. I guess we should keep that in mind as we hear all of these stories that have become part of the folklore of our society these days. For example, of youngsters on a soccer team or a football team or a baseball team, and win or lose, everybody gets a trophy. Well, there is this underlying principle that there is no infallible correlation between effort and success. A losing team may have given it its best effort, but they lost. And there is a loser and there is a winner, and the winner gets the trophy. That's life. That's the way it is in the real world. That's the way corporations behave or should behave. People who achieve, who make contributions, should be commensurately rewarded. That's not the lesson, unfortunately, in too many instances that's being taught in our schools, in many instances in our homes, and that is being carried over generationally into the workforce, which is creating problems. There is a struggle now in the workforce between Generation Y, the millennials, and the baby boomers, because there are a different set of values, different set of expectations. Baby boomers don't understand the attitude on the part of, and I realize I'm making a generalization, on the part of Generation Y, millennials, those born after 1980. And they come into the workforce with high expectations, even an entitlement attitude, and that if I make the effort, I should therefore be rewarded. Doesn't work that way. You have to deliver. You have to make a contribution, and it has to be measurable. The 11th principle is that effective leaders are adaptive. They subjugate themselves to the service of others and are equally proficient followers. There is this concept in the literature on effective management, the notion of the servant leader, the leader who In Jim Collins in Good to Great, in his book, Good to Great, he talks about the servant leader. He talks about leaders who are not necessarily charismatic, but are empathetic, who understand people, able to build relationships, and put the well-being of others, whether they're employees, stakeholders, customers, whatever, put their well-being ahead of their own. Don't take themselves too seriously. Don't take their positions too seriously. They really operate as servant leaders. Furthermore, they are able to make the transition from being a servant leader to a follower, to following other people's leads. And it may be a subordinate, it may be somebody outside of the company, whatever it is, but the flexibility, the humility, the self-confidence to be able to be led by somebody else, if only for a period of time on a particular project. So effective leaders are adaptive. They subjugate themselves to the service of others and are equally proficient followers. Perhaps the folks down in Washington should take a lesson from that one principle. The 12th principle is that the success of human enterprise is determined by the ability to sustain a high level of mutual trust and respect. There is a definition of effective communication that I use in the course that I teach at Villanova and that I used in my consulting. It goes something like this. Effective communication is a sharing of information in an environment of mutual trust and respect, intended to change or modify attitudes and eventually behavior to achieve specific measurable outcomes. It's a mouthful. Let me repeat it. Effective communication is sharing of information, which is power, in an environment of mutual trust and respect, which is culture, shared values and so on, intended to modify or reinforce attitudes and eventually behavior to achieve specific measurable outcomes. I would submit that is not only a good definition of effective communication, it's a great definition of effective management, because effective managers and leaders must be able to share power, create a good, solid culture that is motivating, encouraging, inspirational, in order to change or reinforce attitudes and ultimately achieve specific measurable outcomes. Profit, sales, productivity improvement, share of market, whatever the metric is, everything should be directed towards the achievement of the metric. The success of all human enterprise is determined by the ability to sustain a high level of mutual trust and respect. It is wanting in today's society. It is woefully wanting in many organizations who give lip service to employees are our greatest asset, but don't practice what they preach and create an environment that is not mutually trusting or respectful, rather is hostile. The third principle, the level of commitment to an enterprise is directly proportionate to the answer to 7 questions. They're up on the screen. What's expected of me, or what's my job? Am I valued? How am I doing? Where are we going? How do I fit in? How can I help? And what's in it for me? Those 7 questions were not developed by me. They were developed years ago by a colleague of mine with whom I was working on a number of consulting assignments. He was an accomplished consultant, an author, a speaker, and so on. He came up with 6 questions. I added a 7th. But think of it for a moment. I believe you would agree that regardless of your position in an organization, even if you own the company, there are 7 questions that occur to you on a regular basis that must be answered one way or the other. And the questions are, what's expected of me? What's my job? Am I valued? If I didn't show up tomorrow, would anyone notice? How am I doing? Am I getting feedback on whether my performance is meeting expectations or exceeding expectations or is falling below expectations? Where are we going? What's the direction we're going? A very important question today in these tough economic times when organizations are having a difficult time coming up with a strategic plan that's good for 12 months, let alone 3 years or 5 years. Not only where are we going, but how do I fit in? How can I help? And what's in it for me? Why should I expend the effort? Why should I take the risk to break out of what I'm doing, what my job description says I should be doing, and do something more? There is this dichotomy in many organizations where We receive a job description. It lays out what's expected of us. I hate job descriptions. I think we should do away with them because what they really prescribe is what we're not permitted to do. Because so often management says, we want you to think out of the box, be creative, be innovative, come up with a different idea, take a risk. We admonish employees to do that, but we don't reward them for it. In fact, in many instances, they're punished for it. Which brings us to the final and, I think, fitting of the 14 points. Unused skills atrophy, unrealized potential fosters mediocrity and apathy. Unused skills atrophy, unrealized potential fosters mediocrity and apathy. That's certainly true in the workforce. It's as true, I think, in our families and in the other relationships we have with other people outside of the workforce. So many of us are afraid to try. So many of us have been trained and conditioned to stay within certain parameters because it's safe, it's secure, we won't be hurt, we won't be punished. And yet at the same time, this country is on an entrepreneurial binge of innovation, of demanding innovation and more entrepreneurship. We say again and again, the only real solution to this economy is to revitalize entrepreneurship in this country, in this economy, so the innovators, the entrepreneurs create jobs. And yet we have systems in place, regulations in place that stifle entrepreneurship, stifle creativity, and therefore the unused or unrealized skills and aspirations of people who would like to be creative atrophy. They shrivel up, they die. They're never realized. What a waste. We're forfeiting so much in this country, in the youth particularly, but also in our older generation, because now we have 79 million baby boomers who are coming of age, going into the third stages of their lives, where age is looked upon as a liability. They're no longer an asset. They're a drag on the economy because of healthcare costs, because of Social Security expense, et cetera, rather than seeing them as other societies have, as an asset, as something that should be nurtured because they have so much to give, the legacy they have to leave to the generations behind them. We're still learning that lesson, but in the process, we're wasting a resource, both in the young and the old. There they are, 14 points that I believe help to explain what's going on in our lives and how to understand behavior, the motivation for behavior. I hope you found it interesting and I hope useful. Until next time, this is 30 Minutes. I am Rick Anthony. Take very good care of yourselves.